The Vautour IIN is one of the jet bombers in the new Israeli tech tree in War Thunder. Let's see what it's got. The Vautour started as a post-war project in France to develop a multi-role jet aircraft that could be adapted to a wide variety of combat and utility missions. Faced with a conflicting set of requirements, Sud Aviation designed a fairly conventional airframe using a new swept-wing design and the Snecma Atar jet engine. The early prototypes demonstrated good potential, and a revised version, called the SO-4050, was submitted to the French Air Force after its first flight in 1952. The development ended up taking a bit more protracted time, as the French kept adding additional roles and requirements for the new jet. But it did eventually enter service, and it flew for many years in a variety of roles. Meanwhile, Israel and France at the time had very close military ties, with France basically being the primary military supplier for the relatively new Israeli Air Force. And that kind of made the Vautour a natural choice when Israel needed a jet bomber to try and maintain parity with the IL-28 being flown by its neighbors. Israel ended up flying multiple versions of the Vautour, and they even did some slight modifications themselves, with the first aircraft entering regular squadron service in 1958. The IIN, that's Roman numeral 2, letter N, was a night fighter version of the aircraft, which was equipped with a radar system for performing interception missions at night, and that's what we're looking at here. Israel also flew the Vautour as a pure bomber, a recon plane, and as a jammer to provide cover for other strike aircraft. The only known air-to-air victory for the Vautour was in the hands of an Israeli pilot who shot down an Iraqi Hawker Hunter while providing air cover for a ground strike in 1967. Primary sources differ on exactly which version of the Vautour was used in that combat victory, but it is known that several Vautour IIBs were shot down in the same campaign. The Vautour served Israel until the early 1970s, when it was eventually replaced by the A-4 Skyhawk. Now, the version we're looking at here in War Thunder is the Vautour IIN, the night fighter version, which sits at battle rating 9.0 in rank 5. This was, again, intended as an interceptor and a patrol aircraft, not as a dogfighter or as a ground attack strike fighter. The core of the plane's weapon system is the Drak-25 radar set, which was developed in the early 1950s by a consortium of 4 electronic companies in France. In real life, it's an X-band radar, but War Thunder labels it as I-band for whatever reason, not that it really matters much. There aren't any advanced features, but the radar set does have a good variety of range and angle selections. Unfortunately, the Vautour doesn't have any kind of ballistics computer or a bomb sight, and that's kind of where the problems begin. The weapon loadouts it gets are very much multi-role, with unguided rockets, dumb bombs, and air-to-air missiles, and it can carry the Shafrir 1 air-to-air missile. This is a very basic, low-performance caged seeker weapon, and it's the only missile this plane gets. Now, one thing this plane does have going for it is the cannons. The guns on this thing are very effective and punch hard. Anything you can hit with them is going to be just removed. Now, the flight performance of the Vautour IIN is a bit problematic. The plane has good acceleration, and its top speed is decent among subsonic jets, but it simply can't turn, like at all. At higher speeds, the controls compress hard and provide almost no response, and even at low and medium speeds, control inputs give only minimal reaction from the aircraft. In some of the clips here, it might look like I'm barely making any effort to avoid enemy fighters, dodge missiles, and whatnot, but I assure you, I'm giving maximum control inputs. The plane just isn't responding. Even at the ideal airspeeds, the control surfaces just don't respond. The roll rate is poor, the vertical pull is poor, and all of that suffers even worse if you have any external weapons, which you will. But it doesn't even get much better after you dump your ordnance. If I'm being really blunt, flying this thing feels like flying a 4-engined prop bomber, just with better speed. That said, taking the Vautour IIN into missions is kind of like choosing which finger you want to chop off. To be really upfront about it, there isn't a single mission profile that this plane does well. On paper, it's a multi-role aircraft, and War Thunder classifies it as a jet bomber. But you don't get the bomb sight or any kind of ballistics computer for any of the weapons. Meaning that if you try to go for ground targets, all your bombs and rockets are just blind, leaving your cannons as the most reliable weapon you get, but even then, ammo is pretty limited. Because of how the BR system and Matchmaker works, you're going to get spawned in with supersonic strike fighters somewhat frequently, and even with the bomber spawn, people are going to beat you to the ground targets at least half the time. Add to this a second problem. Even with a full loadout of 4 missiles and unguided rockets, the Vautour is completely ineffective in air combat. So if you get intercepted, you're just done. Now, I want to be very clear on this point. In the Vautour, if someone gets on your 6, there's almost nothing you can do to shake them off. As soon as an enemy fighter gets within 3 kilometers of you, you're entirely dependent on pilot error from the enemy in order to survive. It may seem like it took a while to get this review, considering how quickly I covered some of the other Israeli aircraft, but I've actually been working on this one on and off for weeks now, and being honest, I've yet to find even one single mission profile that the Vautour IIN can perform reliably and be successful at. Anything it can do is completely outmatched by other aircraft in its BR range. The closest thing I got to, finding a successful role for it was using it on larger maps brought into RB from sim mode, and taking a multi-role loadout to hit ground objectives, then finding the AI-controlled target aircraft with the radar and, try to shoot them down to complete the mission objectives while evading the other team. And even that can be done easier with other planes. One thing I do have to give this plane high marks on are the visuals. I've always loved the look of this jet, and you can get some really nice paint jobs for it. The mid-mounted swept wings with those low-mounted engine pods gives the Vautour a very distinct look that really appeals to me and makes the plane a little bit more fun to fly, even when it struggles to win. Now, the landing performance isn't bad either. You get bicycle landing gear and some outriggers on the side of the engine pods, but otherwise, landing the Vautour is pretty typical. You can put out flaps and gear a little over 400 kilometers an hour, and as long as you remember the poor turn performance and set up a long enough landing run, you won't get into any trouble. The cockpit is actually pretty good. It has a radar scope, great visibility, and large instruments that are easy to find in VR mode. I liked flying this plane with the VR headset more than a lot of others. Overall, great cockpit. To close out on the Vautour IIN in the Israeli tech tree. This plane has a good selection of multi-role loadouts, and its guns are just amazing. However, in air combat, this thing is just food for the red team. It doesn't have a ballistics computer or a bomb sight for its air-to-ground weapons, and there's simply no mission profile that this plane can be reliably successful at. The final verdict on the Vautour IIN is, as much as it pains me to say it, just skip this one. It's borderline useless at its current BR in War Thunder's game modes. As always, thanks for watching.